We begin with what is shaping up to be a human rights crisis at our nation's border. And many say, in a large measure, it's a self-created crisis by the Trump administration, by your government. Now, Donald Trump has done all sorts of things. He's tried to sometimes emphasize it and say it's terrible, and sometimes downplay it, allude, and even conflate what's happening with previous administrations. Now, because of the pressure from Democrats in Congress and pressure from journalists and pressure from people who've been visiting these sites, we are now seeing with new depth what is happening inside some of these migrant detention centers, and we're also hearing directly from the detained. Now, the reporting of widespread overcrowding and inhumane conditions has increased. Government investigators publishing graphic photos in the Rio Grande Valley of these migrant facilities. A senior manager at one facility says the situation is now a, quote, ticking time bomb. Or take this photograph, June 10th, McAllen, Texas. The families you see packed behind this fence. This is this area that they've got labeled Pod 2 with very little room for anyone to do anything. You also have families experiencing government-induced overcrowding behind fences, people wrapped in blankets that are very similar to the aluminum foil reports we've seen previously. Or take the pictures out of Westlaco, Texas. Detainees with kids lying on the floor, concrete benches on top of each other, appearing to be basically sharing a single water cooler from what we can tell from our photographic evidence. Some wearing masks over their mouths, some faces, of course, blurred for anonymity. Then take a look at the Fort Brown station, a man seen holding up a handwritten sign that says simply, and I'm going to read it to you if you can't make it out, it says, "Help, 40-day here." Help. Adults also held in cells that are designated for juveniles. Many places are at more than double the capacity, violating all kinds of rules. And this report that's leaked details children with no access to showers, agents refusing to provide children access to hot meals, and adults going without showers for as long as a month, the makings of a public health crisis. Now, some of these photos are coming out after lawmakers got to go visit 2 Texas migrant facilities. Take this video, which we have courtesy of Congressman Castro in El Paso. You can see there a woman in the cramped cell. Castro said there was no running water to be seen there. One woman said she was told if she needed water, she should drink water out of the toilet. The AP has also obtained this video, an interview with a 12-year-old girl. Now, this is from her lawyer. And the statement is that they were basically dealing with this person who was held for 2 weeks. This is a facility in Clinton, Texas. Now, as with a lot of this, we're talking about some crowdsourcing. We're telling you our sources. I have to mention NBC did not record or authenticate the interview, but we want you to see what we're learning.
No le daban poca comida, unos niños que no se bañaban, no los bañábamos, los trataban mal. Allí donde estábamos, eran malas con nosotras. Unos niños enfermos, que allí les decía que lo llevaran al hospital, pero no lo llevaban. Los niños, como la edad de mi hermana, lloraban por la mamá y el papá, lloraban por la tía, y le hacían falta.
Kind of testimony provided via the Associated Press. Now, as we're seeing these pictures and videos and learning more as people make these visits, I should mention that there is, of course, something going on outside of just the journalistic and political process. We have this new footage today of parts of America where people are out, even though it's obviously heading towards a holiday week, activists protesting over the treatment of these migrant children held pursuant to Trump administration policies. I'm joined now by New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg and Paula Ramos, who hosts Vice's Latinx and also worked on Hispanic press for the Hillary Clinton campaign. Good to have both of you here.
Thank you.
I want to start with the big picture. We made a choice here to try to show folks what we're learning from various sources. We, even those reporters who we send out in the field, are restricted a lot in what we can get. But we are not looking at video or footage of prisons. We're not looking at facilities where people have gone through a process and been convicted of a crime and are being punished. That's not what it is, although it looks like prison or worse to many people. We are looking at the detention of individuals, including children, who haven't even had criminal process yet. Walk us through that context.
We're looking at people who have a right to seek asylum. It's that simple. And now these images, it's up to us to look at that and to ask ourselves, what are we seeing? Is that a concentration camp? Or is that a justified image? And people need to start answering that question, right? Because the real question after that is, what happens when no one's looking, right? What happens when you're not showing us these images? What are people doing to these kids and to these moms and to these fathers inside? That's another question, right? So,
and do you know from your work on the issue, when we talk about the overcrowding, there are variations in migration. We've covered that on this show. There were variations, regardless of who is in charge and regardless of what you think of this president. But beyond those variations, when you look at the overcrowding, when you look at the treatment, what is the evidence you have that it is a deliberate policy, a deliberate outcome of this administration?
The evidence, we just saw it. We just saw a little girl saying, "Nos tratan mal," which means in English, they're not treating us well. That is the evidence we have, no? That's it. We don't need to look any further. This is not a debate. This is a young girl that is telling us, "Está mal," it's bad. That's evidence.
There are people who think it's a debate, as you know. Before I go to Michelle, I want to play something for your response. The pictures tell the story. The administration was knocked back on its heels on other points during the immigration debate over pictures, over facts, although it keeps going back and forth. But here's what some of the rest of the country is hearing about, which I think goes to the politics and the debate about what this is like. Is it what you just said, or is it more like an overcrowded house party?
Picture yourself, you have a house, family of 5, you have a party, you have 30 people over, maybe you have a big party, you have 100 people over, and you have 2.5 baths. In the beginning, it would be okay with 30. Then after 100 people, it would be a little bit taxed. Maybe you got to get an outdoor facility. Can you picture 5,000? You could have the best facilities in the world, but they are so overstocked. It wasn't their idea to have a wide open border. It was bad asylum rules that allowed this to happen.
This does not surprise me. No, they see a house party, I see a crisis. I see human beings, they see criminals. I think this is unjust. They think this is justified.
Michelle, at most house parties, among other things, there's freedom of movement. I mean, I hate to be logical about this, but one of the differences between a party and a prison would be freedom.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that you just see the sort of depths of absurdity to which people have to go to justify the images that are right in front of their face, you know. And I think that's something we see over and over again with this administration, where people, both the administration and its apologists, are going to tell you that you're not seeing what you're seeing, right? You're not seeing something that looks like the torture of children, that looks like an atrocity. What you're really seeing is an overcrowded house party. And whether or not it's true that the administration did not ask all of these people to come here, that that there is these vastly increased migrant flows. But it is the job of any administration to deal with crises, right? It is the job of any administration. First of all, this is not a new problem. You know, this has been going on for at least a year, this increased family migration. And it is a job of an administration to make things work, not to simply say we're unprepared and who could have expected. And the other thing is that my colleague, Caitlin Dickerson, on the news side of the New York Times, has reported on the way the administration has taken steps to make it harder to release children in detention to sponsors, right? So part of the reason that the system is so backed up is because you're supposed to move the kids from there, then to ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement at Health and Human Services, and then to a sponsor, like a family or a friend or someone maybe known to the child who's going to take care of them. What the administration has done is it has started using that process to catch undocumented immigrants. So it's asking people for DNA tests, for fingerprints, for the fingerprints of everybody in their household. So they have kind of taken deliberate steps to keep kids in detention longer, and then they turn around and say, well, this isn't our fault.
Take a listen to, on the Democratic side, Chairman Nadler dialing up the heat on what he thinks can be done about this. Take a look.
All the people in the administration who have done this, who have permitted it, are guilty of child abuse, which is a crime. We ought to prosecute.
I hope they do. And, you know, House Oversight has just announced that they're going to be having hearings next week. I don't think we know yet whether or not the leaders of the various departments are going to consent to go before Congress, because this administration often thinks that congressional hearings are optional. But I hope that, you know, I very much hope that somebody does. And you know, we also know that it's often difficult in this administration to tell where malice ends and incompetence begins. But we do know, as a result of this Facebook group that has also come to life, I think over 9,000 Border Patrol agents are part of this Facebook group that is dehumanizing migrants, that is, you know, dehumanizing and spreading kind of, you know, pornographic memes about Latina and Latino members of Congress. And so in those cases, I think that we can assume a level of malevolence that goes beyond just being under-resourced.
Well, you mentioned that. It's very important. Both of you stay with me. Let me give everyone a little bit of background, as Michelle was saying. There's been this reporting today on this Facebook group. It's Border Patrol agents, and they're posting about all sorts of things, including what they call jokes about migrant deaths. ProPublica revealed the group. Now, as I mentioned with some of the other reporting, we're bringing to you what we know. NBC we haven't gotten our hands and verified the group or the post. But based on their reporting at ProPublica, they cite group members responding basically with what they look at as wisecracks to a news story about a 16-year-old Guatemalan migrant who died while in custody. An agent writing allegedly, "Oh, well." Another posting, quote, "If he dies, he dies." Now, this ProPublica reporting also talks about something was just mentioned, sexist memes, a vulgar illustration of Democratic Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. Now, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol says they're investigating this and going to figure out what went on, saying the posts, if true, are completely inappropriate. For more depth on this, I actually want to bring in to our conversation a former Border Patrol agent, Jen Budd. She served in San Diego 6 years before ultimately leaving the force. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Your reaction?
I'm not surprised at all. This has been the way the Border Patrol has been run since probably before even I was an agent. There's a reason why only 5% of agents are females, and it's not contrary to what the chief says. It's not because the work is very difficult. Women can handle it just fine. It's because a lot of them are sexually assaulted and harassed in the agency, and it starts in the academy, and it's the type of environment and the atmosphere that the Border Patrol condones and allows to continue and has for decades.
So those writings that ProPublica sources to current officials, they strike you as how typical of what you saw and experienced, both, shall we say, online or also offline in conversation and in your work?
They're very typical. I would say that if you're in the agency yourself, then it's much worse. Female agents, it's not unheard of to be raped and assaulted by their classmates in the academy like I was. And you're not allowed to report this or else you will lose your job. You're not allowed to file a complaint or else you will lose your job because they have to investigate and so forth. And the people that commit these atrocities and write these things or say these things, they continue on. And everybody knows about it. It's the dirty little secrets of the Border Patrol. And every time one of their agents does something like this or somebody discovers a secret page or website or whatever, the management always says, well, this is just not like us. We're honorable. We only want the most honorable people. But yet it keeps happening over and over and over again.
And I appreciate you, being willing to talk about this. I don't imagine that's easy.
No.
I want to ask you about the enforcement aspect, and then I want to let Michelle, a panelist, journalist here, also ask you a question after me.
Okay.
But my question goes then to everything you've already said, as we say in the law, allegedly or if true, sounds horrific, criminal, unacceptable, period. Then there's the second layer of what ProPublica and others are reporting here, which is, does that also, in addition, taint or corrupt the way these agents do their jobs? So number one, are they mistreating, as you just alleged and explained in your history, your story, each other or others? And then two, in your experience, though, did it also bias or corrupt the way they were supposed to do their jobs, which is they're in charge. All the pictures we just showed at the top of our broadcast, they're in charge of these people. They have control over these people. Did you experience or observe that also as an impact?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the academy, if we're trying to talk about the, how, like you said, how it affects how you enforce, you have to remember that 52% of the force is Latino, and a lot of people ask me, how do they get Latino people then to behave this way against people who are of their own heritage and their own culture? And it's because in the academy, they mandate and they teach the agents to use racist terms for migrants, so that they see these people as other and that they are not like them. And it's not uncommon, it's very frequent for Border Patrol agents to arrest women coming across the border and then set up dates afterwards with them on the south side. It's not uncommon for many sexual assaults to be filed against agents. And so I think definitely it does have an effect. It's condoned. And when it happens, and if somebody complains, everybody groups together, specifically more the male side, and they protect each other, and they push everything out, and they stay quiet, and that's how it works.
I mean, I'd be curious to know where you come down on the kind of malice versus incompetence question, because obviously one of the things that supporters of Border Patrol are saying is that they're just overwhelmed and under-resourced. That was part of the justification for Congress just giving them this huge new budget supplement. And so I'm curious, from what you know, is it that they're operating on a shoestring and don't have the resources to deal with this influx, or do you think it's more about kind of sadism and punishment?
I would compare it to when I was an agent. We had about less than 5,000 agents for the southern border, and per year we would get an average of about 1.5 million apprehensions. Today they have roughly 19 to 20,000 agents, and this year has increased, but they are nowhere near the numbers that we used to have. So with 4 times the amount of agents, they seem to be able to do a lot less than what we had to handle back then. So they should be able to handle this. The demographics have been changing over the years, but they've had decades to deal with this situation. This is not a criminal law enforcement situation. This is a humanitarian asylum situation, and asylum is not a crime.
Right. And you mentioned something Paola mentioned earlier, and that we've reported on repeatedly here, which again is, even for folks who watch this and have a view about immigration, a view about border crossings, we're not looking at what is supposed to be a criminal punishment setting. We are looking at what is supposed to be temporary detention. Jen, as I said before, I appreciate you sharing your story. I should mention again, as I sometimes do in our reporting, that DHS, of course, says they're investigating the incidents that led into our discussion. And, of course, we invite them on to discuss any of this, as we often send out requests to the Trump administration. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.